Turning overseas, there is a massive Israeli military operation underway in the West Bank. Israel has launched drone strikes on the city of Jenin, and troops are also on the ground battling Palestinian militants. Palestinian officials say at least 7 people are dead and more than 24 are wounded. Israeli officials say they're targeting the city's largest refugee camp in what they call a counter-terrorism effort. Hundreds of fighters for militant groups, including Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Fatah, are based in the refugee camp. This is the second raid conducted by the Israeli military on the city in 2 weeks. Journalist Rebecca Collard is in Berlin tracking the latest for us, joining us now. Rebecca, what more can you tell us about the operation and then also the response to it?
Yeah, Hillary, so we know this operation started a bit after midnight local time with airstrikes on Jenin from unmanned drones. And then really since the early hours of morning, there has been these operations inside Jenin, mostly, as you said, inside the Jenin refugee camp. Now, Israeli military officials have called this a brigade-sized operation. So that could mean anywhere, really, Hillary, from 1,000 to 3,000 Israeli soldiers on the ground. So this is a very, very significant operation. And, you know, as you just said, Israel is saying that this is a counterterrorism operation, that they are targeting these Palestinian militant groups. We had comments just now from Israel's foreign minister saying that, you know, they're going to take every measure they can not to injure civilians. But again, this Jenin refugee camp is extremely, extremely densely populated with civilians, and it's very unlikely that they will be spared the violence that we're seeing. You know, looking at these images where you see this smoke rising above Jenin, rising above the refugee camp next to Jenin, and then this barrage of gunfire and the thought of these explosions. So a really, really intense operation this morning, Hillary.
Rebecca, of course, you've covered this conflict for years as a Middle East correspondent. So can you put the recent escalation of violence that we've seen, can you put that into a wider context?
Yeah, Hillary, I think it's really important to put this into the wider context that, you know, of course, in the last bit more than a year now, we've really seen an escalation of violence in the West Bank. And I think there's, of course, a lot of factors for that, but I think there's some bigger structural ones. And, you know, on one hand, Israel has now the most right-wing government it has had in its whole history. So that means a couple of things. First of all, we've seen an increase in attacks by Israeli settlers on Palestinians in the West Bank, and we've seen increasing impunity for those attacks. And I also think that the narrative, the things that we're hearing from Palestinian leaders from Israeli leaders are making Palestinians less and less hopeful that there's any paths to statehood. Now, I'll just point out, Hillary, you know, we're 30 years since Israeli and Palestinian leaders signed the Oslo Peace Accords. Those Oslo Peace Accords promised a Palestinians a state within 5 years. You know, we're 30 years later. There are thousands of new Israeli settlers in the West Bank, and the Palestinian leadership is seen as less and less credible by a lot of Palestinians. So, you know, there are 10 years past elections. I think there's a lot of Palestinians that look at the Palestinian leadership's tactic negotiations as unsuccessful, and we're also seeing this massive increase in armed groups in places like Jenin and places like Nablus in the West Bank, carrying out attacks on Israelis and Israeli forces.
Rebecca, thank you for this. We appreciate the reporting there. Rebecca Collard for us in Berlin.